This is Karl and Phil talking management for the Globe and Mail. Phil, for the last couple of series, what we've been going through is the 4 steps in the typical manager's career, starting with going from being a superstar to a manager, from being a manager to a leader. This time we're going to talk about going from the C-suite, or going from being a manager into the C-suite. So it's a big step in people's lives.
Right.
And next time we'll talk about potentially a transition from manager to entrepreneur, perhaps later in your career. A lot of my boomer friends are going through that now. So when you think about the C-suite, what we see is that most people in their 20s and 30s and 40s want to be in the C-suite. And the C-suite is like the CEO, the CFO, the Chief Operating Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, the senior executives in an organization. And I think it's great in that age. I remember in 1980, I had a 20-year plan. 1980 to the year 2000 when I was at IBM, and I found it a couple years ago. It was really amusing to see that I had set out 20 years and where I'd be at the end of that time, and how quickly I got derailed over that process. But I still had that dream, and I remember last year I was reading Fortune magazine, and I was flipping through and I ran into an article which featured a guy I had worked with at IBM, a couple years older, but my mother has in her basement a picture of the western region of IBM Canada back in 1985 or something, and John Swainson was his name. He was a couple feet down from me. We were both tall, so we're in the back row. And I was reading there, and I see a picture of John. And it's an article how he became a CEO of a Fortune 1000 company down the States. And I read through that and becoming more and more dismayed at how well he had done, how successful he'd been at IBM and now with his company. And it was quite silly because after I got to the end, I flipped back and looked at the picture, and I realized to my relief he was really overweight. Right. And that psychologically made me feel better that, well, maybe he's made a lot of money, been very successful, but at least I'm not too overweight. You know, it's kind of sad to think about that, but there is a huge cost being in the C-suite. And the fact is that most people won't make it. In fact, many don't want to be there when they get later on in life and start realizing the sacrifices that are required to be there. But it's still a great dream to try to be in the C-suite. And I encourage certainly young people to dream that dream. Why not? And we need a lot of people in those positions, particularly if the boomers retiring and the Generation X and millennial generation will have those opportunities. But when we think about the C-suite, what comes to mind when we think of what a CEO is, Phil?
Certainly, it's the stuff that I see in the news. These larger-than-life figures, people who are going to be vocal, aggressive, charismatic, have a very strong vision, work long, long hours, and really sort of focus and commit on the company and where they're going. I see people like Steve Jobs, I've seen Bill Gates, Lou Gerstner. All of these people have the skills, the energy, and the drive that in my mind is what one needs to be in the C-suite.
No, absolutely. Well, I think that's a very good point, Phil. When you think about it, it's enormous energy required in order to be in the C-suite. Reminds me of a friend of mine who was a senior executive at Bombardier when Paul Tellier was CEO. And he tells the story of how he and Paul would often fly out on a Sunday night, and they would have to fly over to Europe for meetings at Bombardier's transportation head office in Berlin. And they would fly back Tuesday. And they did this week after week.
Oh my.
And what was astonishing was how this young guy, I played hockey with him in his 40s, great shape, found that Paul Tellier was 15, 20 years older at the time, well, I guess still is, kept going. Paul Tellier is ever-ready bunny. And he just has this enormous energy, even now in his 60s. And it's funny, I interviewed his son, Mark, who's the CEO of Yellow Pages, spent a day with Mark, and Mark had that same high energy level. So part of being in the C-suite is just a high energy level, which is DNA to a certain degree, and I guess not screwing up your health along the way with, drugs and alcohol and things like that, and looking after yourself. But it takes that kind of stamina, determination that you talk about. But it's interesting, I was reading a book a little while ago, it's Good to Great by Jim Collins. And Jim talks about what are some of the requirements for a great leader. And certainly it's about having a strategy and a vision and communicating that effectively. But I think it goes beyond that. And what he talks about, it's a real paradoxical combination of will and humility at the same time. And I found that quite interesting finding. What do you think, Phil, about this need for humility?
Certainly this idea that one shouldn't be ego-driven. One should look around and sort of, if there's a success, attribute the success to the organization, take the responsibility for the failures, and be leadership, use the values, follow your values as you go through leading the organization.
What one of the needs these days, I think, is communication. You think of Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, Bill Clinton, again, a different party, Obama, just wonderful communicators, are such strong values these days, Phil. And again, we can't be, executives can't be an Obama. But I think there's a need for that ability to really communicate and get people on board. What have you run into in your experience?
I think even at all levels, communication as you go from manager, and then it becomes even more important as you go up. And I remember going to company meetings and listening to the executive and the CEO, and the ones that really impressed me were the ones that could tell the story and would get me involved in what they're saying. I would feel that, yes, this is what I want to do, and this is right. And it was the emotion, the storytelling, and made it concrete for me and all of us there in that, the general information sessions in there. So certainly the sort of storytelling, making it concrete and making it real for us was very valuable for us.
It's interesting, Phil, because on our advanced leadership program that Henry Mintzberg and I run here with a bunch of other people, we have sessions on storytelling and sessions on emotion. The last couple of years, because what we see is one of the roles of a leader is to tell stories well. And so we spend a day with a master storyteller from the States, just a wonderful guy, and just a marvelous session where we go through that. Then we have a colleague from INSEAD come over and talk about emotions and the role of emotions. In fact, when you go down the Academy of Management, which is the big business prof and doctoral student conference every year, about 7,000 to 8,000 people show up. There's dozens, well over 100 presentations on the role of emotions at work these days. And so this is an area which I think is an increasingly part of today's leadership, is around emotions and around the ability to tell stories. Now, we're not going to be Reagan or something like that, but what we can do is at least improve our skill set in that area. But it brings me to another topic, and one I think it's important, because I've interviewed maybe 100 or so CEOs and a couple hundred C-suite people, and one of the questions I like to come back to is work-life balance. Because it's one that I wrestle with. Maybe that's partly why it's so important to me. But it's something where it strikes me at this level that their view of work-life balance is one where you work on the weekend. That you're going to work some Saturday and Sunday, you're going to work 1 or 2 evenings a week, and you probably won't get home till 8 or so in the evening. Is very typical. And when most people think about that, they don't want to live those kind of lives. They want to be there for the kids' soccer game, they want to be there for, maybe have a hobby themselves. Where these men and women are ones that are willing to make that sacrifice, and I guess their families as well are willing to live with that. And I think that's something which is something for people to think about. I had dinner recently with a CEO, has 4 kids, and I talked to him about growing up with him, and I said at one point, I guess they appreciated the money, and he looked at me and I said, well, that's about all they got from me. And I found that a very poignant moment, to realize that was probably the truth of the matter. Great guy, really like him, and kids seem to have turned out well, but I don't think I could do that myself. So work-life balance is a tough thing. What do you think about work-life balance in the C-suite, Phil?
Certainly the question of work-life balance begins even as a manager. You start to have this question about work-life balance as you're spending later hours. And then I see the executives and the CEO, and I imagine that question just gets more and more difficult and harder to answer as you spend more and more time in the C-suite and as the executive working with the customers and operations. I think this is a question that the executive has to figure out as they go along and make that decision as they go forward. This is going to be a very personal answer.
Yeah, so I think it depends also on who you marry. And what their needs are, what their desires are. So it's an individual personality, both you and your spouse. I think when you have children, it becomes more of an obligation where young children don't have a choice. Where who you marry, they have a choice to marry you and they kind of understand who you are. But with children, I think there's a sense that you got to have a bit more of a commitment there just by nature of what you're doing. But it's not wrong not to get married or have kids at all. Like, that's perfectly fine these days. And it's nice to see that some people don't need that, don't want that, and they can give a lot to their jobs, and societies are richer for it. So Phil, we've been talking today about the C-suite and going from manager to C-suite. Next time we'll look at going from being a manager to an entrepreneur that increasingly I see people doing. So this has been Karl and Phil talking management for the Globe and Mail.